Rose Whitfield was 19 when she knocked on Bumpy Johnson's door at 2 in the morning, crying so hard she could barely stand. She should not have been there. Everyone in Harlem knew you did not go to Bumpy Johnson's home unless you were desperate or foolish. But Rose had nowhere else to go. She was holding a photograph of her father, and the man who answered the door was the only person left who might remember why that photograph mattered. This narrative is a dramatized reconstruction inspired by the era and public figures, not a verified historical account. Bumpy stood in the doorway in a house robe, looking at this girl from Small's Paradise, someone he had seen 100 times but never really spoken to. She was shaking, there was blood on her sleeve, and when she finally spoke, what she said changed everything. "My father told me if I was ever in real trouble, I should find you. He said you owed him a debt from Sing Sing and that you were the only man in Harlem who still honored deaths to the dead." Bumpy did not move for a long moment. He was thinking about a promise he had made 13 years ago to a dying man and what keeping that promise might cost him now. Then he stepped aside and let her in. What Rose did not know yet was that bringing her father's name into Bumpy Johnson's living room had just activated something that could not be stopped. And what Bumpy did not know yet was that the federal agent who had destroyed her father was now coming after her, using methods that made prison look merciful. Rose's father was named James Whitfield, and he had saved Bumpy Johnson's life in Sing Sing prison in 1946. 3 prisoners had been paid to kill Bumpy in the yard. James Whitfield was not a fighter. He was a bookkeeper convicted of embezzlement, a quiet man who read philosophy and wrote letters to his daughter every week. But when he saw what was about to happen, he stepped between Bumpy and the 3 men. They went after Whitfield instead, and by the time guards intervened, Bumpy was alive, and James Whitfield was being carried to the infirmary with 2 broken ribs and a permanent limp. Bumpy visited him that night. "Why did you do that?" he asked. James looked at him through swollen eyes and said, "Because you have people depending on you out there. I only have one person, and she is better off without me setting an example of cowardice." Bumpy never forgot that answer. When James Whitfield died in Sing Sing 7 months later, from pneumonia the prison medical staff failed to treat adequately, Bumpy made a promise to a dead man that he would look after the daughter if she ever needed it. That was 1947. This was 1958. Rose had never asked for anything until tonight. She sat in Bumpy's living room, hands shaking, and told him what had happened. A federal agent named Thomas Kellerman had approached her 3 days ago. He showed her photographs of her father, prison records, and fabricated evidence suggesting Rose was involved in drug distribution. He said I could help him build a case against you, or I would go to the same prison where my father died. He gave me 48 hours. That was 2 days ago. I told him no. I told him I did not know anything and would not lie. Tonight, he came to my apartment with 2 other men. He said if I did not cooperate, they would plant evidence in my grandmother's home and charge her. My grandmother is 73 years old. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Rose finished, he asked one question. "What do you want me to do?" Rose hesitated. "I want to disappear. I want my grandmother safe. I do not care what happens to me, but I cannot let them hurt her." Bumpy stood and walked to the window. Harlem was dark outside. 3 a.m., the city sleeping except for the people who never slept. He was thinking about James Whitfield, about a promise made to a dying man, about what honor meant when the law itself had become lawless. But he was also thinking about something else. Going against a federal agent meant surveillance, pressure, maybe prison. It meant risking everything he had built over 20 years for a girl he barely knew, because of a promise made to a dead man who could never know if he kept it or not. For a moment, just a moment, he considered telling Rose he could not help her, that the debt had limits, that survival sometimes required breaking promises. Then he turned back to Rose. "You are not going to disappear, and your grandmother is going to be fine, but I need you to trust me, and I need you to do exactly what I tell you." What Bumpy Johnson was about to do would put him on a federal target list that would follow him for the rest of his life. He knew this. He had watched other men challenge federal authority and disappear into prisons upstate, where nobody ever heard from them again. But the alternative was breaking a promise to a dead man, and Bumpy had built his entire reputation on the principle that his word meant something, even when nothing else did. So he made a choice that terrified him more than he would ever admit to anyone. The next morning, Bumpy did something he had not done in 15 years. He walked into the 28th precinct and asked to speak to the captain. Every officer recognized him immediately. Phones were picked up. Conversations stopped. Captain William Harrigan, who had been trying to arrest Bumpy since 1953, came out with an expression mixing suspicion and curiosity. "Johnson, if you are here to turn yourself in, I will need to sit down from the shock." Bumpy did not smile. "I am here to report a federal agent for criminal activity. I have a witness, I have evidence, and I want this on record, filed officially, and sent to the FBI regional director today." The room went completely silent. Captain Harrigan stared at Bumpy for a long moment. His hand moved to his service weapon, not drawing it, just resting on it. Every officer in the station was watching through the glass windows of the bullpen. Bumpy could see them reaching for their own guns, waiting for Harrigan's signal. This was the moment. If Harrigan decided Bumpy was playing him, if he decided this was some kind of setup or distraction, Bumpy would be in handcuffs, or worse, before he reached the door. The room felt smaller. Bumpy's heart was beating faster than it had in years, but his face showed nothing. Then Harrigan's hand moved away from his weapon. "Come into my office." What happened in that office over the next 90 minutes was later described by Harrigan as one of the most surreal conversations of his career. Bumpy laid out everything: Rose's father, the promise, Kellerman's coercion, the planted evidence, the threats. He provided dates, times, witness names, and he provided recordings. Bumpy had wired Rose's apartment after she left his house, and when Kellerman returned that morning, everything was captured on tape. Threats, admissions of fabrication, explicit acknowledgement of operating outside legal parameters, enough to end Kellerman's career and possibly put him in prison. But Bumpy could not be the one to file this report. His criminal record meant any evidence he provided would be dismissed as fabrication or revenge. So Bumpy made Captain Harrigan an offer. "You file this report. You take credit for uncovering federal misconduct. You protect Rose Whitfield and her grandmother as witnesses. In exchange, I give you something you have wanted for 5 years." Harrigan leaned back. "What could you possibly give me that would make me trust anything you were saying?" Bumpy pulled out a ledger and set it on the desk. "Names, dates, and locations of every corrupt police officer in Harlem taking payoffs from operations I do not control. You want to clean up your department? Here is your roadmap." Harrigan picked up the ledger. He opened it. He read 3 pages. Then he looked up at Bumpy with an expression that was very difficult to read. Bumpy had just handed him was not just evidence, it was ammunition that could destroy him. Every corrupt cop in that ledger had connections, friends in the department, people who would want to know where Harrigan got the information. And there was only one answer to that question. If word got out that Captain Harrigan was making deals with Bumpy Johnson, his career was over, maybe worse. Bumpy had just put his own neck on the line by walking into this building, but he had also put Harrigan's neck on the chopping block right next to his. "Why?" Harrigan asked. "Why would you give me this? Why would you help me?" Bumpy's answer was simple. "Because I made a promise to a dead man, and because the agent threatening that man's daughter is doing something worse than anything I have ever done. And because if I have to choose between protecting my operations and protecting that girl, there is no choice to make." Captain Harrigan made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He sat at his desk for a full minute without speaking, and Bumpy watched him, trying to read which way this would go. Harrigan could take the ledger and arrest Bumpy anyway. He could use the information and claim he developed it independently. He could burn the whole thing and pretend this never happened. Bumpy had no leverage, no protection, no guarantee that doing the right thing would work. He was trusting a police captain he had spent 15 years avoiding, gambling that one man's integrity was stronger than institutional loyalty. Harrigan filed the report. He sent it to the FBI regional director with a note that federal oversight had become compromised by agent misconduct. He assigned 2 officers to protect Rose and her grandmother, and he opened an internal investigation into every name in Bumpy's ledger, which resulted in the dismissal or prosecution of 14 police officers over the next 18 months. Thomas Kellerman was called back to the regional FBI office that same week. He was questioned about his methods, his evidence, his timeline. The recordings were played. He had no adequate answers. Within 30 days, he was reassigned to a desk position in a different state. Within 6 months, he faced an internal review that effectively ended any possibility of advancement. The case against Rose Whitfield was closed without charges. But Bumpy Johnson's protection of Rose came with a cost that was far greater than giving up a ledger of corrupt cops. What happened next was exactly what Bumpy had feared when he stood in his living room at 3 in the morning, deciding if keeping a promise was worth destroying everything he had built. The FBI did not just investigate him, they came after him with focused institutional rage, usually reserved for people who had killed federal agents. This was not about justice. This was about punishment, about making an example of a man who had embarrassed the Bureau. The FBI opened a formal investigation into Bumpy's operations 3 months after Kellerman was reassigned. The surveillance was constant, the pressure was relentless, and it was clear that someone in the Bureau had decided that Bumpy Johnson had embarrassed a federal agent and needed to be made an example of. Associates started getting arrested on minor charges. Businesses that Bumpy protected were raided repeatedly. The legal harassment was methodical and sustained, designed to dismantle his network piece by piece. But the real damage was not the arrests or raids, it was the doubt. Some of Bumpy's people questioned whether protecting one girl was worth this level of federal attention. There were quiet conversations in rooms Bumpy was not invited to, suggestions that sentiment had clouded judgment, that personal promises should not override organizational survival. Bumpy heard about these conversations. He knew his authority was being tested in ways it had not been in years. He knew that if he showed weakness now, if he admitted doubt, the organization would fracture. So he never responded to those suggestions directly. He simply continued operating by the same principles, and the people who could not accept those principles eventually left. The people who stayed understood something fundamental. A man who would break his word to protect his operations was a man who would eventually break his word to protect himself, and nobody wanted to work for someone like that. The federal investigation continued for 3 years. They never built a case strong enough to charge him, but the pressure never stopped, and Bumpy knew it never would. That was the cost, and he accepted it without complaint. Rose Whitfield graduated from City College in 1962. She became a teacher.
She spent 37 years teaching in Harlem and never spoke publicly about 1958, but she never forgot. And in 1975, something happened that nobody expected, something that proved even men who spend years justifying their worst actions sometimes cannot escape what they know to be true.
Thomas Kellerman retired from the FBI that year. He was 53, his career stalled at middle management, and he had spent 17 years carrying what he had done in Harlem. On his last day, he did something unexpected. He wrote a letter to Bumpy Johnson, handwritten, 3 pages, delivered through channels that ensured Bumpy would receive it. The core of it was this: I have spent 17 years trying to justify what I did to Rose Whitfield. I told myself I was doing my job, that the ends justified the means, that people like you were the real criminals. But I was lying to myself. What I did was wrong. It was criminal, and you stopped me when you could have used my misconduct to your advantage. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that you were right about me, and I was wrong about everything. Bumpy Johnson never responded to that letter. He kept it in a desk drawer, and when he died in 1968, it was found among his personal papers. Rose Whitfield learned about the letter's existence years later, when she was contacted by a researcher writing about Bumpy's life. She read it once, then asked for a copy. She kept that copy in the same box where she kept the photograph of her father that she had brought to Bumpy's door in 1958. Nobody knows why Bumpy never responded. Maybe he thought words were unnecessary. Maybe he believed Kellerman's 17 years of silence spoke louder than any apology. Or maybe Bumpy understood something most people never learn, that forgiveness is not about making the person who wronged you feel better. It is about refusing to let their actions define your choices. This story does not fit into simple categories. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal who protected someone the law should have protected. Thomas Kellerman was a law enforcement officer who committed crimes in pursuit of career advancement. Captain Harrigan made a deal with a criminal to expose corruption in his own department. Rose Whitfield was caught in a system where innocence mattered less than leverage. The question this story raises is not about who was good or bad. The question is what we do when we have power and someone vulnerable needs protection. Do we use that power, even when it costs us? Bumpy Johnson answered that question one way. Thomas Kellerman answered it differently. The 17 years between Kellerman's misconduct and his letter suggest he spent a long time understanding the difference. If you lived through those years, you know these contradictions. Protection sometimes came from unexpected places. Legal authority sometimes acted illegally, and the people who deserved respect were not always the ones wearing badges. When you had power, how did you use it? When someone needed protection, did you provide it? When keeping your word cost you something, did you keep it anyway? Those are the questions that mattered then, and they matter now.